My guest again today is Randall Bock.
There's been a lot of misinformation put out and kind of a resistance to information. And now misinformation and information kind of is in the eye of the beholder, a little bit like beauty. And I think we find that there's in-group and out-group aspects to science, like anything else. It's kind of like the Mean Girls kind of aspect. I think there's a little bit, we saw the Mean Girls in doctors Fauci and Collins, the way they herded off Dr. Bhattacharya and others, Scott Atlas, and when they presented pretty harmless anodyne studies of kind of coronavirus immunity in Santa Clara County, I believe it was California, 2020, and so they were made enemies of the state. I actually have an article on my Substack, and I recommend everyone buy my Substack, but it's Randoctor, RANDOCTOR at Substack. It's a piece I have recently on Peter Hotez, who's kind of Dr. Fauci's mini-me. I mean, they're both diminutive people, so I don't want to point on that aspect of it, but they just both happen to be. But Peter Hotez was recommended as Dr. Fauci's replacement, NIAID. He didn't take that up. He pointed out that, he quoted Maxine Gorky on one of his anti-science pieces, kind of pointing and labeling at everybody who doesn't agree with them on COVID as anti-science. And of course, this is inimical to the project of science itself, which is open inquiry and debate. So the term science means actually two things. Unfortunately, I brought my fingers here, 1 and 2. And so it means two things. It's the actual body of knowledge you have is science. We have conscience as a word, which is kind of our knowledge base. And that's the other thing. The science is the other thing, is the process by which you gain that knowledge, by which you accredit that knowledge. And it has to have, basically trial and error and trial and error and trial and error, replication. And so, there's a whole cycle of having a hypothesis and then testing it and then reiterating and changing your hypothesis. And you wind up getting closer and closer to the truth over time. I mean, some things are unknowable, like what does a woman really want? Who's going to win the Super Bowl 10 years from now? But we can make approximations and we can test those. And speaking of the football part, I watched the game last night and I watched a few games the other days. My New England Patriots doing well. It was unpredictable from a year ago, but the science of playing the games out, if you consider like the actual, butting of heads on the football field, a form of science that's determined which is the better team. Let's say that's your scientific experiment. Which is the best team this year? Well, theoretically, baseball, apparently, if you wanted to actually get the best team in the World Series, you'd have to have, I think, play 53 games, a best of 53 series, because there are going to be quirks. Sometimes, lucky bounce here and there. Somebody strikes out the wrong moment or a wrong call, and a best of 7 series is not adequate. But if you had a best of 53 series, you'd almost always get the actual better team if that could be determined. And so science kind of gets played out in front of our eyes all the time. And I think guys like sports more than women like sports because we kind of have, Larry Summers got kicked out of Harvard for saying this, but, men kind of have more of this categorization aspect to them. And they have, say, the science mind where they have to kind of test and retest and retest. And we see this a little bit. It's not to say women can't do it, of course, but we have kind of more affinity for sports, and say women might have more affinity for dance. One of the great bonding moments my wife and I had was Dancing with the Stars, watching it, that is. And we did a little of our own dancing for Fred Astaire and whatnot. And that's a beautiful thing, and it's creative, and we watch it play out and so forth, but it's not necessarily science. The way it gets adjudicated has some aspects of science, and I'm going to bring that up later, because one of my other analogies, which some people on Daily Skeptic liked, was how we adjudicate science. If some sciences are softer than others. If physics, we can adjudicate like, NFL. We can have instant replay. We can watch the play over and over again. We can see and some other things like sociology might be more like judging figure skating or Dancing with the Stars. So there is kind of a way, after you watch Dancing with the Stars, you can, I think almost everyone will agree who are the top 3 dancers, who are the really bad ones, who are the really good ones. And when it gets to the fine points, there's other things that happen. And so there's going to be a way where I can't necessarily judge the best sociology paper But a certain group of sociologists might, and then we on a secondary level will have to be able to judge them as well. So that's a little bit of the predicate of what prompted my writing this article. And maybe we can just dig right in, unless you have any preliminary questions.
Just one quote of yours that struck me as you were talking there. You said, quote, when COVID hit and real dissent might have saved lives, the Guild did not open the doors. But the real dissent would have saved lives in the COVID case. It's the stakes are enormous, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And it goes on over and over and over and over again. My little cause célèbre has been Zika microcephaly, and it's out of the news. But this is an ongoing problem where, Zika was the biggest pandemic in the world until, COVID came along. And still there's, billion young families throughout the tropics that, are working under the false fear that a single mosquito bite can unalterably change the cherished life within, and they stay indoors, they slather insecticide on whatever, insect repellent and all that kind of stuff. When they're pregnant, because they're working on this presumption that Zika, which is a real virus, causes microcephaly, which is a real condition, but they actually have nothing to do with each other. And this is not filtered through the peer review process. And there has to, there tends to be an aspect wherein the people who are getting paid to do this type of research don't necessarily want to cut themselves off from the benefits of getting paid. So when if you happen to be, tropical medicine person like Peter Hotez, for instance, I mentioned, it's been, as Saturday Night Live, Garrett Morris, as the baseball player, says, it's been very, very good to me. You have that ability to get paid. You'd be kind of a lunatic to say, oh my God, Zika is not real. So there's the emperor's new clothes aspect, Hans Christian Andersen's story, where, the emperor gets sold a really sheer bit of clothing. It doesn't exist. And nobody in the amongst his courtiers can point that out. It takes somebody from the outside to do it. So I'm the little kid. My wife would agree with that oftentimes. I think you need kind of a fresh perspective to look at this. And again, I'm not an academician per se. I don't have a professorship or anything like that, but all to the good in my view. So, I've tried to get things in the peer-reviewed journals, and I roundly get, kind of shunted aside for my Zika microcephaly theory, which holds up, which is, and again, people should not only do my Substack, they should buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika. There's been no Zika microcephaly anywhere on Earth, including Brazil, since then, but nobody talks about it. Anyway, so that's my little, kind of the other aspect of what made me write this piece. And then it was also inspired by my friend and hero, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, whom I got to meet once again in Salt Lake City. So I'm ready to dig in after all the, extended intro.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So what you have is a fundamentally broken scientific sociology. This is his words, that emphasizes authority rather than ground truth, enabled by an utterly incurious press devoted to propping up essentially a political party. This is from 2005. John Ioannidis was Dr. Bhattacharya's Stanford colleague. And Bhattacharya, I think, went to undergrad, then medical school, then PhD, then professed at Stanford, and Stanford booted him out, by the way. Essentially, we'll get to that part where he's his words excommunicated from the board of professors at Stanford. So this kind of shows the framework of an in-group, out-group thing we were talking about, the high school lunchroom aspect. But in 2005, Ioannidis published this kind of seminal piece, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. I'm not going to get really into this, but it's a problem that is of note. This is 20 years old. So this is more recent, it's 2020. He was quoted at the NIH. Ironically, or interestingly, the reporter is Eric Bock, no relation, but spelled the same. And he says science isn't perfect, but it's still one of the best things to happen to humankind, et cetera, et cetera. We need to find out how we can best perform, communicate, verify, evaluate, and reward research. And this is to my point. I had not read this until today. I was looking up the other thing for him to make the slide. And I found this, interestingly, that he is talking about what we need to do. And he's a professor of biomedical data, science, and statistics, co-director of the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford. So if he, gets a chance to look at this, I, hope that we can chat about it. So getting back to Dr. Bhattacharya, he said truth is determined by whether other people, humble scientists looking at the same thing, find the same thing or something very close to it. And he came up with a word I hadn't even heard then. And I'm kind of a word guy. I do crosswords and cryptics and all that kind of stuff. But he said, is there consilience? Great word. Is there a different way of approaching it that still yields the same answer? And because consilience is kind of this, like Zeno's paradox, you wind up, approaching that same point of everyone looking at things the same way. Truth, he said, cannot come from hierarchy, it must arise from independent conversions. So Dr. Bhattacharya's framework points to what he calls a second scientific revolution. And whereas I see it, I don't want to argue with him, he's the expert, but I see it instead as a scientific restoration. And that's only because the words revolution and restoration are sometimes contrary to each other. Revolution can kind of leave things very messy. Think of the French Revolution. There are very few kind of neat revolutions. I would, think the American Revolution was one which brought about a better order. But I see this kind of more as a restoration of what science had been before peer review, which was a fix. Now, the problem is not a lack, in my view, of intelligent or capable scientists, rather it's the structure. I know a fair number of Soviet expats here, and some of them are scientists. And, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we learned that its engineers had been world-class, but trapped inside a system rewarding conformity. Modern science is in a similar bind. The talent is there, the architecture is wrong. In Bhattacharya's model, truth would rise through convergence rather than hierarchy. I agree with this direction, but transparency alone will not overcome the entrenched incentives that allow insiders to ignore or decline to replicate what threatens their priors. So restoration requires a structure of feedback and consequences. My proposal builds on Dr. Bhattacharya's, but goes further. It borrows from markets, Bitcoin, gaming, and fantasy sports, where entire ecosystems work only because participants accept rules, carry risk, and live with outcomes. We were in Vienna last summer, and I saw a number of Rembrandts there, probably more in Amsterdam. And, a lot of these people look like me, apparently. But, that's not why I put it up there. But as you can see, there's kind of left and right, what the guild is. The guilds are not a bad thing. We generally always form guilds of one type or another. I belong to a tennis club. Everyone there plays tennis. Some people are swimming, I guess. I belong to another one where they also play squash. And so everyone is there to work towards getting the squash or tennis courts better, that people can participate, they can enjoy it, blah, blah, blah. There's lessons. So we do guilds all the time. Whatever kind of training you wind up with is a guild. And they started in the 12th century, and this is a form of civilization. This is a form of advancement. They provided, you can see on the left, training for workers, employment. They did restrict competition. They regulated price of goods. Anyway, they made kind of a nice play box. If you want to get your family together and play some game, whether it's Trivial Pursuit or Monopoly or whatever the game, you have to all get together, agree on the rules, and you're all going to be polite and deal with things. You're going to have fun. You're going to eat food. You're going to take a break, whatever. Those are guilds in a sense. And the guilds happen throughout this kind of, post-medieval era and build, society the way we see it now, that people got good at doing certain things. You go across Europe, the buildings, are all of a certain way. The cobblestones are all a certain way because they had guilds. They had people who were really good at that thing. And that's fine to a point, but it doesn't necessarily allow for competition. So we, as guilds might apply to the science, a modern era, we don't really have all the things that we would need to make it better, to have it have the competitive aspect. And so I have, it's kind of small print here. People can stop the slide and maybe expand it. But I'm not going to go through all these one by one, but, there is kind of an impact factor cartels and there's a barrier to entry like the guilds had, you have to join, or you think of a union, you have to be part of that thing in order to get your stuff going. So I can't sit at a union job. I can't go attend classes at Harvard unless I get permission. There are various kind of closed societies within our society. So if I want to, say I'm a professor at Harvard, I can't. I need to go through certain statutes and requirements. I might have to have a PhD. I might, whatever. Even if I want to teach at the public school here, Albert Einstein, if he wanted to teach physics, first of all, he's dead. That might not disqualify him, but being a great physicist would not get him to teach in my local public school because he doesn't have a teaching degree. That's a guild aspect. And so, you have the way where Albert Einstein might be a great physics teacher. He can't go out and do that because he's not part of the teachers guild. So there's going to be, with our scientific modern era, there's going to be certain kind of nepotism. Anyway, there's a lot of ways where there's both acceptance and blacklisting. This is what Jay Bhattacharya experienced, and others. And I have as well: desk rejections, blacklisting, grant sabotage, public shaming, career excommunication, so forth. So that's kind of the way that guilds can work. So what's the answer for this? Again, kind of combining my interest in sports and my gadfly interest in science. We have here the scientist baseball card. So science that lacks the kind of external scoring today. The model that I'm going to outline below is my modest proposal. That's from Jonathan Swift. It supplies what the current system cannot: incentives that reward accuracy and discourage gatekeeping. When we get a bunch of baseball players or football players or whatever together, let's say football players, there's quote unquote inner city. There's a lot of guys there that absent kind of organized football might not be doing all the best things in society, but they can channel, let's say they like to be violent, let's say that a certain number of guys like to hit people. Well, you can go do that. You can become Michael Brown, do strong arm robbery, and then, kind of be idolized, I guess, George Floyd, et cetera. But, if you wind up on the football field, you could channel that energy into something productive. And because there are rules and rewards of what type of hits you can do. So you can do you can't do head on, helmet on helmet. You can't kind of lay all your whole weight on people, but you can kind of knock them out of bounds. Where there's a lot of things you can do and to be very rewarding in a monetary sense and rewarding in a kind of an emotional sense when you see, a lot of guys that might have otherwise, failed lives in a sense, they get resuscitated. Like I think Derek Waller, a huge tight end for the Raiders at some point and other teams, had criminal past and so forth, but he kind of found his life again. He left drugs and whatnot, and he gets channeled into doing the right thing because he learns the right way of doing it. But his work gets adjudicated. He has to compete against other tight ends. He has to get, onto a team. He has to follow the rules, and he has to do the plays the right way. And it has to be adjudicated to see if it's a winning type of process. And so, the idea here is to have the science, he's holding the pipette, as a baseball bat, but, we would be able to evaluate him in his career the way we evaluate our favorite or least favorite baseball, football, fill in the blank players. We see what type, what the things he proposed, his batting average is, did he get his replications confirmed? His Bayesian score, did he accept challenges to, verify his data? Did he win those challenges? So this would get away from the John Ioannidis point that most of science, or, a good half of it is not even replicable. Dr. Bhattacharya, in his speech that I saw at Brownstone's event in November, Salt Lake City, said that as head of NIH, he wants to have the kind of the stats on a paper, not just have the paper, but have the basic kind of recipe and formula, and have that reproducible, to have that open source and whatnot. So anybody could pick up where that other person had left off and do it. And this is, kind of getting, that's first halfway there to kind of get the basics of what is the play that's being run. But then to see if it gets run better by other people and who could have predicted how well that play would be run. So if you wanted to be a coach, if you want to become Sean McVay and coach the Rams, you have to kind of beat out a whole bunch of other players, other coaches or whatever, to show that you have a better sense of what those plays are. So in this case, there's not just the scientists, but they're going to be coaches and reviewers and other people on the outside who are going to be able to, basically get their own props based on how well they could predict how these players are going to do. So if you want to do well in the sports world these days, you can kind of bet on it and make a lot of money if your theories are right about how the plays are being run. And again, I think this is very applicable and transferable to science. So the Gilded Age of Science, I'm not going to go over all of this, but basically, peer review is intended. So, there's a little old lady who swallowed the fly. It's a kid's song. And she thought she might die. So she, I think, swallowed a frog to eat the fly. And then that gave her problems. So she had to swallow a cat to eat the frog. And I'm not going to do the whole song, but then she swallowed a dog to eat the cat. So sometimes we have a solution, but the solution is worse than the original problem. And so peer review is not a forever thing. It actually, Albert Einstein, getting back to my friend Albert Einstein, and my mom actually met him, Albert Einstein. So I'm one degree of separation from Albert Einstein. She walked him around Central Park in the late 1930s because he liked having young people walk him around Central Park. And her parents and were friends with Albert Einstein's friends. Anyway, Albert Einstein put out his stuff without peer review. It was rechecked and so forth. And he had to, state when people didn't understand relativity, he put out the proposal for an experiment. It was verified, during the solar eclipse and whatnot. And his theories took hold. Now, is everything Albert Einstein said correct? Well, we don't know yet, but it's going to be run through whether peer review exists or not. But peer reviews was intended as an impartial check on the truth. It's hardened into a guild. And we see the same drift. This is just a comparison. The judiciary, where, circuit court judges, they often track power over neutrality. And while the design is impartial, the humans are not, presenting the oldest problem in governance: who judges the judges. And so peer review is no exception. It's a mechanism built to protect inquiry, even with anonymity and conflict of interest form. And as the quote said, now sorts researchers and research into in-group and out-group faster than a high school lunchroom. So how has this problem existed? Barry Marshall, I actually had the honor of having him on my show, and he's one of my heroes. He was unable to get his research published on peptic ulcer. And speaking of I have my mom, her dad, my grandfather, he had peptic ulcers. And I remember going down to Florida on a vacation just with them, my grandparents, and my grandma, wouldn't let him eat anything that wasn't white. He was like on a white food diet because they were like, oh, that's how you fix ulcers. You can eat, cheese and macaroni and whatever. And somehow the white, blander foods, bread and whatnot, were going to keep you from getting peptic ulcer. You couldn't have any spicy foods. And all. It turns out it was a bacterium. Now, we didn't know that back in the 1960s. And it wasn't for decades later until the 80s that Barry, and I remember going through medical school, hearing about the same kind of thing, bland diet and whatnot. And there were antacids, and Tagamet was coming to, cimetidine was coming into existence. And it turns out all of that, it was a bacterium. I remember my jaw, metaphorically, my jaw dropped because it was a bacterium. You could just get rid of it. And it was just like an incredible thing. My grandfather would have had, so much better time, taking, one course of antibiotic rather than having to go through, decades of listening to, about certain foods he couldn't eat. And so this is a quote from him in his Nobel Prize lecture. I realized then that the medical understanding of ulcer disease was akin to a religion. No amount of logical reasoning could budge what people knew in their hearts to be true. To them, bacterial cause was preposterous. And I think the interesting point there is hearts. People might think with their hearts. That means they're thinking with their emotion. And there's no way of not doing that because we are humans and that's how we do stuff. But, our brain is theoretically more the computer part, but sometimes it's hard to admit new data. And so, peer review I point out, in my article, both that, peers are actually parts of royalty. The peer system, the peerage is royalty in England and probably other places. So peer review is kind of not just the jury of your peers part, but it has this kind of royalty aspect to it. And in this case, I've kind of got a hanging judge there. A lot of these, thank you, ChatGPT, for making my slides. They kind of have this, early Renaissance, late medieval era look to them. And so you either like it or you don't. I'm sorry. But there are just a number of examples I pulled up where, the contrary theory was, kind of rejected, was not allowed to be in the journals. Now, obviously, when Einstein came up with his theory, it was not accepted immediately either, but he didn't have this kind of barrier of entry to get into the discussion room. So the real key here is, if these science journals are going to do the sciencey kind of thing, which is to do the, replication and get things into the body of knowledge, they have to be good at it. And they have to have the open-mindedness, not think with their hearts and think with their wallets. They have to be able to think, impartially. And so, getting back to the sports analogy, there's a lot of money involved there, more money than in science, I would venture to say almost. I'm not sure whether the NFL is bigger than the NIH, but if you, actually take in all the people who bet on it, all the people watch it, people, I think, understand more, the Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl, than they might understand the, amyloid in Alzheimer's. And they understand kind of the Johnny Depp, Amber Heard story, or the O.J. Simpson story, better than they understand mitochondrial replacement or Zika microcephaly or H. pylori or any of these things I mentioned here. And the reason is those things are played out in kind of the judicial arena of the public sphere. So Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, everybody knows the facts about that. And they watched it. They had it not only with their hearts but their brains. And there are probably some people who were with Amber Heard, but I think almost everybody came on the Johnny Depp side. I came out on the O.J., that O.J. Simpson was guilty right from the get-go. The jury didn't agree with me. Fine. The juries can make mistakes here and there, but I think ultimately the truth will out. So ultimately, O.J. Simpson, wound up serving on a civil case and other criminal issues and whatnot. But, the truth will out. The question is whether that truth gets heard fast enough. O.J. Simpson, his untruth or whatever got heard almost immediately. Johnny Depp, ditto, because they get heard and adjudicated in an open fashion. And I want that kind of openness to carry over to science. So this is from the climate world. And these are quotes that I think I cut off a little bit. I apologize. My career prospects would be much better if I had never written papers that question the IPCC. The skewing of the literature and careers can only be bad for society. This was by these two guys in 2011, Michaels and McKittrick. And Michael says it is now virtually impossible to publish anything against the alarmist grain. The piles of unpublished manuscripts sitting on active scientists' desks are growing into gargantuan proportions. So he can't get his word out. So again, Amber Heard got her word out. She went to court. People heard it, so forth. Pat Michaels and Ross McKittrick didn't have the advantage that Amber Heard had of being heard, no pun intended. So this slide I kind of went wild with. If you know who Savonarola was, he was kind of a censorious monk in Italy, a little bit kind of Taliban-ish back in the day. And he got rid of certain books and whatnot. It was basically, his way or the highway. And so because they rhyme, I have Payola meets Savonarola. Sorry about that, just my creative license. And so payola is a term that came about in 1938. It has to do with the old Billboard charts. So, interestingly, Spotify and stuff like that is much more of an open system. We kind of determine what's good based on likes, shares, and whatnot. So if this happens on our social media platforms, X, Nick Shirley has a post that is popular. 120 million people have watched the thing on the Somali, scams in Minnesota because they wanted to. Is it a good post? I guess so, because 120 million people are watching is better than my post, probably because 120 million people have watched it. The Billboard 100 was not quite like that. It was a matter of pushing things. So if you wanted your song to get heard, it might be a great song, and maybe there's some aspect of having better songs, be the ones that the agents want to push, but you had to pay to play. So that's the term payola. You had to pay to play to get in. And so my feeling is that Jay Bhattacharya's critique of scientific authority converges payola with Savonarola. And that's the end of my bad pun. Sorry. So another one of my kind of anti-heroes, actually, there are a couple of in the same picture. I have an article in my Substack I mentioned about Peter Hotez. And I actually started this article like 3 years ago. I didn't have a Substack then. And I went to a certain point, I didn't publish it because he wound up not getting the NIAID position. But I had kind of peace in waiting because I am not a Peter Hotez fan. We went to the same college. I had a few years behind me at Yale. We never met. But, I kind of expect better of Yaleys back in the day. But he wrote Anti-Science Kills: From Soviet Embrace of Pseudoscience to Accelerated Attacks on U.S. Biomedicine. And he wrote this during the COVID era. And he's total pro-vaccine. Now, mind you, like Dr. Fauci, I wrote an article on Fauci, actually 3 of them. There's Dr. Fauci 1.0 and Dr. Fauci 2.0. The 1.0 is, I think, the honest version. So if you look at Peter Hotez and Dr. Fauci before COVID, they said normal, medical virologists, researcher type things. Although Hotez is not a virologist, I think it's tropical medicine. Anyway, they said, like herd immunity from natural herd immunity is better than viral immunity, better than vaccine immunity. They said that a vaccine is probably not going to work for, this inhalation aspect of coronavirus. Anyway, they said normal medical things. And then once the vaccine was in the prospect and being put out, they kind of backtracked from that. They said, basically my way or the highway. And Dr. Fauci said he is science, which is the most anti-science thing to say. And the thing that kind of stuck in my craw was Peter Hotez quoting Maxim Gorky, the famous Russian novelist and excellent novelist, but he became a Soviet over time. He was a socialist. And when the socialist Kerensky government rose and fell very briefly, like the one in Iran right between the Shah and the Mullah, there was a brief democracy. In Russia, the same thing. He became a communist and Leninist as well. And Gorky, they put in charge of the scientists. So they basically had literally a scientific guild, and you were either in it or not. If you were in it, you were a communist. And if you were a communist, you'd get the money, and the science didn't matter that much. And so, oddly enough, Hotez quotes Gorky, the communist. His quote is a little bit longer than this, but he kind of misquotes it like this: without science, democracy has no future. Well, everything depends on definitions. Without this kind of like Marxian type of science, you wouldn't get the Democratic Republic of North Korea kind of democracy. So in order to get open democracy, you need open science. In order to get closed democracy, you need closed science. I think that's kind of the thing that really bothered me about this, that prompted that article. And so to kind of, as part of, another aspect of the guild is the tenure trap. So this is like within the university. Most of our quote unquote science doesn't come from Albert Einstein, who was not part of a university. He was I think a patent officer. And I think at one point he worked at a train station. I don't remember exactly, but his ideas were running around in his head wherever he was. So, while in his off, like doodling, whatever, he was doing this other thing. So he had kind of a second life as a physics theoretician. I mean, who knew? But now we have this thing within the universities, and that is kind of the channel to get your stuff published. You have to be in the university. Whenever I try to put an article in one of the scientific journals, they need my accreditation. And it's a funny thing because I don't have any. I have a credit score, when I get a credit card, but I don't have accreditation. So I'm just kind of I'm just a molecule in this thing, and I have to make one up for University of Randy. Anyway, so this gets back to, I was at a group, a party, and when I was speaking with a professor, and she told me that tenure, which is there supposedly to create academic freedom, has accomplished the opposite. Instead of liberating scholars, it's built fortresses. She said, once a chair gains tenure, the drawbridge goes up. Those allowed inside are precisely those who will not challenge the chair. So for instance, if a tenured Marxist runs a department, he's not going to want to hire Thomas Sowell or Milton Friedman. He's going to hire disciples who echo the worldview and preserve the lineage. So this is the guild aspect. You want people not upsetting the guild. If you're the Cobblestone Guild, you don't want somebody saying, oh, we should, tessellate like MC Escher. It's not, what, these octagons are that's what we do. These are the hexagons, whatever. That's the way we do these tiles. That's it. Get back to work and so forth. They don't want challenge. They want to keep doing what they're doing because that's been very profitable. Lord Acton, who was a peer, by the way, has a famous quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he foresaw the insulated, funded, guaranteed authority to decide knowledge that will eventually drift towards self-parity, by which time it's visible. This slide points to Nature magazine, theoretically the top, kind of sciencey journal on earth from the UK. They published, literally, this is a true article, a feminist queer crip approach to the gut. You tell me what that means. I don't know. I joked it's like the colonization of the colon, or the anti-colonial aspect of the colon itself, complete with claims of intergenerational trauma, of famine, and queer stoma pride. Again, you tell me. So, there are serious fields still in those magazines, like oncology or particle physics, but in the softer zones, ideology strolls in while dissent is shown the door. The annals of science, and again, this is a bad pun, the annals of science in her case, are nearing a bad pun. If they want our respect, if they want money, and Nature and Science, the New England Journal and JAMA, this is where careers are made or broken. If it is publish or perish. This is an actual thing, metaphorically in the professor world. You need to do that. And if you publish, there's all kinds of gradation of journals. I had lunch recently with an MD PhD friend of mine, and he gave me the inside story of this. He's very much in favor of it. That's part of his milieu. But there's kind of they in their own minds grade these journals A, B, C, D, E, whatever. And so if you get in the New England Journal of Medicine, that's that can be the difference between your getting tenure or not getting tenure. And so this is kind of the credentialing system, and it's not that dissimilar to Lord Acton's becoming a lord. I forget what his original name was, but he was given this lordship, and then he was a lord thereafter. And professorship has a similar kind of flavor and action to it. So have there been kind of unpeer reviewed kind of counter revolution or restoration? And so this archive, ARXIV, is the closest thing modern science has had to a spontaneous, what I call open republic. This is not the Democratic Republic of North Korea. This is kind of more the open republic that presumably we have. So democracy is not just, democracy is not perfect in and of itself. Aristotle pointed out, the democracies can go bad. They can become the tyranny of the majority. 3 wolves and a sheep voting on dinner. It's not always going to turn out well for the sheep. So what we prefer is kind of a constitutional republic that preserves minority rights. In this case, the minority rights would be those of, who are not on the inside. So you could be heard at petition, like Amber Heard, or somebody who was able to sue in court and have kind of an equal basis with somebody who has more prestige if you happen to be in the right. So in the 1990s, Archive came along, ARXIV, and it showed what can happen when researchers bypass bottlenecks. So physics, cosmology, and machine learning all accelerated because work was posted immediately, debated immediately, and iterated immediately. This is, again, much more like the world of competition. Apple versus Microsoft. But more open in a sense because you're passing your theories along for immediate review. But Archive also revealed the limits of an honor system. That's what it had. Once AI tools made it possible to kind of spray the server Archive with auto-generated papers, Archive had to clamp down. Proof that openness without cost or consequence becomes noise. A true restoration, which is what I want, must keep what worked about Archive, the speed, the daylight, the debate, the iteration, while correcting what broke it. There were no stakes in the system, there was no skin in the game, and no mechanism to distinguish workmanship from spam. A minimal bond or stake would have stopped the deluge instantly. The problem was not open posting, it was costless posting. So if you don't have any skin in the game, you shouldn't be in the game. I don't have, as bad as the New York Jets were last week playing the Patriots, they're not going to, take somebody from the stands coming into the field and trying to, play the game. You have to, be bonded in a sense and insured in order to get on the football field. And again, that sounds like a guild aspect to it, but there's going to be some elements of that are going to still work in the current in the new iteration. So what do I propose? So this is a complicated slide, and people are going to debate this and try to perfect it over time. But this is my view, the scientific claim life cycle. This is the Randall Bock method 1.0. Maybe 2.0, but when it comes up, it'll be something beyond. It'll be probably something better than this, but it'll have certain elements of it. So this is my modest proposal: building a scoreboard for science. So again, the NFL has one. There almost every week there's some rule that I never even heard of. I'm not going to get into it. What constitutes grounding? I don't know, player out of bounds, and catching the ball on a punt. I mean, who knows? There's all kinds of things, but they have it all kind of categorized, but then people have to adjudicate it. So I think you need the framework. And so my feeling is if the problem is a guild, the solution is a league. So imagine a republic of evidence modeled on the competitions we already trust. So like the NFL, I mean, again, not everyone trusts the NFL perfectly, but it's better than not. Claims not whole papers become the meaningful unit. Discrete testable statements with pre-registered protocols. This is again getting to what Jay Bhattacharya said. Code, data, and lab notebooks go on an open, tamper-proof ledger the moment the claim is registered. Everyone who signs a claim stakes something small, reputation plus a modest bond. Financial. The labs can insure some of the junior researchers, so no postdoc has to choose between rent and publishing. And then there are going to be the secondary layer, which, like what the NFL has, the reason it's so popular is their prediction markets and replication bounties allow anyone to bet for or against a claim, just like we can bet against a game or even a player doing well, or a running back or something like that. You can bet on the number of fumbles in a game. Liquidity comes from 1% surcharge on existing federal grants, plus matching philanthropy from, others, let's say Steve Kirsch and whatnot, people like that who want science to be better. And the whales are boxed out. State caps are tied to income verified academic identities, a little bit like LinkedIn does, or X, when you have a blue check mark and whatnot. Transparent position sizes, and a rotating referee council akin to the NFL's replay center, with adjudication of the judges as well. Again, I think people should just pause on this, and it's a lot to take in all at once. But this is kind of an ecosystem where a claim has kind of a meta life cycle. It has to create trust in the marketplace. They're going to be, people have some skin in the game when they put this stake up, and then they get a reputation based on how well things go. There's going to be replication bounties where people are going to be incentivized to replicate this, and then counter replication, whatever, to disprove it. There's going to be a prediction market secondarily on how well people think this is going to do right from the get-go. This is going to help people become Jimmy the Greek of science, that their word, Bill Nye, the science guy, can say he is one, and Neil deGrasse Tyson can say he is one, but then he has to actually say, oh, I think this in my field of expertise, this is the physics thing that's going to really blow you away, and cold fusion is not. So if let's say cold fusion comes along again, what happens here? You put up I think these guys in Utah said cold fusion. You can make, kind of like endless energy out of a coffee cup, whatever. They have to, put some up there. They have to have, there's going to be an audit trail. There's going to be data feeds. There's going to be a settlement ultimately. Now, is it 90 days? I don't know. But all this kind of thing is going to make this much more, again, like the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial that I think people have very firm opinions about, or O.J. Simpson, whatever, than it is about, what most studies are. Now, it's not to say that all these studies are going to get to that reach, but within the realm of people who care about this, people will care about this. And these things will be adjudicated. I think so far, there have been like 260 games in the NFL. I haven't watched all of them, but all of them were watched and all of them were played out. And moment by moment, every single game had its statutes either held up or overturned. And so forth. Even people can argue about it after the fact, whether a catch was a catch, all that kind of stuff. But it was very closely adjudicated. Not everyone's going to be happy with every result. I think when the Patriots lost their perfect season and David Tyree held the ball against his helmet, was it a catch? Apparently it was. And they weren't happy. Not everyone, some people made money, some people lost money. But at the end of the day, there was an answer. Now, is everything going to have a perfect answer in science? No, but you're going to come much closer when you have this kind of very interested group of people, wanting to work on this to change their own reputation, how they win, the same way people win and lose, following the NFL and so forth. And this is, not really a useful slide, but, the blue is the prior probability. It's kind of a Bayesian update. We see this when we, I don't know if you, again, follow games, but this is kind of hard to see in this slide. But, you have a prediction market of how, if you follow a poly market on the, on the elections, there's various times at which somebody's being favored over another. We also see it with, let's see, this is not really what I wanted. This is the research comeback, getting back to football. The Patriots, it's not quite a perfect example, but, the Patriots-Falcons Super Bowl, I think the 2016, they were up 28-3, and they were, prediction market had them winning the game, almost 100%. At a certain point, things changed. And it wouldn't look like this because this is not, somebody would have to, have to total 100%. So the ChatGPT got this wrong a little bit, but ultimately you get the idea that at a certain point, it turns out the Patriots, were the more resourceful team. And so, they kind of won this scientific bet over time, even if it looked the other way at a certain point. So let's see. So these, it's kind of like a, people can either spend time on the slide or not. It's just, it's just kind of a fun way of looking at this thing, a way that, all these different types of things can have their own kind of, football game themselves. Everything becomes a game where those claims have to, stand on their own and to see whether they're strong enough. So in the Republic of Evidence, truth emerges from interconnected claims outweighing slotted peer reviews. And so there might be a scoreboard where certain, people who have, Epimaster, epidemiology master, virology lab, how well they have done. So if Epimaster was always right about the market, say, there are people on X who are, predicting certain Bitcoins or market shares, and you wind up having your favorites based on how well they do. Now, are they going to be right all the time? No, nobody is. So you're going to have people with their kind of batting averages, public score, they might weigh in on something, and it's going to, I think, do a job. It might not be perfect, but it's going to do better than just having kind of the credentialed, siloed, tenured class doing it instead. So I think that's, pretty much it for me. I was fortunate enough to hang out with Dr. Bhattacharya back then, and I think I'm done with my slides.
Okay. I think there was a postscript, or you've had some feedback on this already, right? Since you published something on this?
Yeah, a little bit, not enough, but we'll see. there's word that it's being, my article is being read behind the scenes, certain places. Dr. Bhattacharya tells me he reads my stuff, and I believe him. So we'll see whether, anything happens on this. But I think, I think this is probably a little bit of, research grant money away from being formalized. I think that, I mean, again, nothing is being formalized. I just think that my process would probably have to, get adopted. And that would be the trick. My having my nice, cute little ideas is great. But there are a lot of ideas out there. Not every idea gets to be, a startup. Not every startup gets to succeed and whatnot.
So is there some way to start this up, bootstrap it in a small way first, or start small and work up, or how would you start?
Well, I'm kind of an idea guy, not an execution guy per se, but, I'm open to ideas on this. And I think that, people hear this, feel free to contact me. I'm contactable. I'm on X at Dr. Randall Bock, as long as you spell the names right. You can send by carrier pigeon, however you like. I think there's room here to figure stuff out. There are people commenting on the Daily Skeptic article, some people commenting on the Substack piece of the same name. I think that you could obviously do it in more of the adjudicated sciencey type of science fields. I think, I mentioned cosmology and physics, which, cosmology is a subset of physics, but things where, gravity's pretty reproducible. I got a pen, it drops down every time. I have my experiment, my theory is that, because this pen is blue, it'll go down. Like I take a red pen. Oh my God, red pens do it also. Well, maybe it's just blue and red pens, but something like that is probably an easier thing to adjudicate, my claims than, I don't know, percentage of people speaking English in countries throughout Africa tend to have less tuberculosis or whatever. It gets tricky, the more people you have and the more kind of ways you have to source and suss out whether those claims are true to begin with. So, who knows? But I think it could easily, Archive already did it in a sense. They had the open aspect part where people are kind of voting up and down things. They have the crowdsourcing part. X.com has this. Grokpedia is trying to do it versus Wikipedia. There's the kind of endless sourcing towards truth. And obviously these things get political stampedes one way or another. So people have tried to, play around with the poly markets when Trump was, against, Biden and whatnot. And so people, there are always going to be these whales trying to do things. But I think at the end, you can kind of figure them out as well. And so, X has done it by like sourcing where people are. It's like, oh, you make believe you're Palestinian protester, but you're actually, sitting in, Kazakhstan or whatever. So I think once people have their reputation, they have to say what they mean what they say, and they get validated themselves. They have to prove who they are. You're going to get a better thing. We already have that to a state. Right now, I don't think any of the tenured professors are fake. I think they're all real. And so they put their papers out and all that kind of stuff. So the validity part is still there, but the validation part is not.
Okay, and one specific question on the problem with Archive, that you said the problem was costless posting. Do you have an idea of how much they could have charged to fix the problem? Any order of magnitude?
Well, no, I don't. I don't have an idea of that. My idea is not so much the cost of putting your piece in the paper or the archive.
Yeah.
My idea is more the secondary market. That there has to be a market of how people feel about that idea and put their own reputations towards that thing. It's easy to think something. It's easy to criticize something, but if you do it publicly, I had wedding vows, 1,000 years ago, I got married, and a lot of people, my patients would come to me and they'd say, why get married? I've been with her, 5 years, whatever. I say, well, when you get married, you say things in public. You're announcing it in public to your peers, in a sense. You're doing a peer review of your relationship. You're announcing, I marry this person, I love this person, et cetera. And it becomes, a promise. It becomes a validity that you're willing to back this. Now, if you're willing to marry your work, God bless you, and put it out there and put it with your whole heart and soul. If you're just doing papers to kind of get the paper churn and people are willing to, kind of turn a blind eye and get those papers churned, then it becomes a problem. And because AI exists, their archive was unable to stem the flow of self-generated papers and people putting stuff in and garbage and whatnot. So there's GIGO. You want to limit the amount of garbage in. So you need kind of the validity of who it is. And, I don't want to watch a fake AI NFL game, between a man. I mean, at some point, I assume AI can generate something that looks like a real game. I mean, there's John Madden football. There's all these kind of mock game of games. When you want to watch the game, you want to have the real players. They have to be bonded and verified and whatnot, and they're going to back it up. So I think, again, a lot of these systems already exist, but they exist in the sports world, in Bitcoin, the stock market, all that kind of stuff. We have markets on X.com. We have markets of ideas. We need them to extend to peer review because we are, right now, you and I are paying for peer review. The federal government, through our taxes, pays for a lot of research, and it's going towards guild. And I don't think you're getting that much value for it. And it's not the only source of money towards research. It's also, there's a lot of private pharmaceutical and other science-based companies are putting their money into things. I don't know if the answers come out better or different or whatever, but the whole system of how those claims kind of get their truthiness, to quote Stephen Colbert, is really the key here.
Okay, so in the show description here, I'm going to have put a link to the Daily Skeptic version of your article, and there's also another slightly different version on your Substack, so people can check that out. And I want to read a little quote from your Daily Skeptic article. I think it's a great article, a lot of good quotes in it. This is from you. Give men and women a system with no consequences, and they drift towards comfort, conformity, turf protection, and suspicion of outsiders. These are not purely or only moral defects. They are universal tendencies. Any system that denies this will drift into stagnation and hierarchy. I think that's excellent.
Well, thank you.
Anything to add to that? Yeah.
No, yeah, I would, because I always do. But I was listening to Jerry Callahan's, he's a podcaster, he's a sportscaster also, well, he used to be sports writer. And he was talking about the Somali debacle in Minnesota. He says, I don't blame the Somalis. It's a moral hazard that you put the money out there. They're being used as a vehicle. I think it's a kickback scheme like the USAID thing. It's a kickback scheme so the Democrats in Minnesota can become, the eternal party there. And so they're kind of using the Somalis, these shell corporations, to give them money, and the Somalis are making money on it. And a lot of that money goes back, I assume, to candidates. And he says, why would I blame the Somalis for this? They, are coming to another country, they don't speak the language. And this is, a pathway to money. Like I don't blame, he doesn't, I assume he doesn't blame the local Native Americans for running casinos. That's what has been given them. You may like casinos or not like casinos, but that's what's there. That's the industry. And so they basically kind of casinoized the Somalis and they got their own share back of it. Why blame them? So I don't blame, the people doing this. I think this is a system issue. And when you have a better system, people act better.
Okay, we're up over our hour here. Any other points you want to make before we finish up?
No, sir, except one, which is, I think that I wrote this separate article on mental health parity, which is a very bland topic, but I think it really could use a little bit of scrutiny by some of your other, skilled listeners and viewers, because it's kind of part of the system, part of the thing that's breaking our healthcare kind of bond. And finances. And so that's a whole nother day, another topic, another talk. But it's, kind of, it segues into this a little bit because there's been a lot of pseudoscience in the softer sciences regarding mental health. So that's a side note.
All right. And I have not read that yet. Is that on your Substack? Can I find it there?
Yeah, I will send it to you.
Okay. Yes, I'll put that link in the show description.
It's also in Brownstone, some mental health parity article. But I just don't think it's gotten enough play. And it's hugely important. It's really kind of the straw on the camel's back for healthcare.
Okay, I'll put that in that link in the show description, and I will let you go. Thank you very much for what you're doing, and hope to have you on again, Dr. Randall Bock.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.